The Palmach, the striking force of the Haganah, came into existence in 1941 and was dissolved in 1948 with the establishment of the Israel Defense Forces. During World War II, the Palmach took part in the fight against the Nazis. Paratroopers like Hannah Senesh landed in occupied Europe. At war's end, it led the struggle against the British mandate in the land of Israel, while spearheading the drive that brought in more than 85,000 illegal Jewish immigrants from Europe on some 70 ships. The Palmach also aided thousands of Jews from Syria and Lebanon to enter Israel over land. During Israel's War of Independence, the Palmach's Harel Brigade, commanded by Yitzhak Rabin and Yosef Tebenkin, comprised 3 battalions. Beginning in December 1947, the young men and women of Harel escorted the food and supply convoys struggling to reach and redeem the besieged city of Jerusalem. After months of bitter fighting, the Harel Brigade finally achieved its goal, securing the highway to Israel's capital city.
One by one, the years pass by. Almost without thinking, young Israelis place flags on rusted scraps of metal. Modern cars whiz by hillsides covered with trees. The road to Jerusalem, so inspiring yet so tragic, a moment frozen in time. Only someone who's seen the blood screaming from the roadside, the blood of the hundreds killed and wounded, can write their epitaph. Here lies courage.
He was only 15 when he died. An only son.
They gave all they had, expecting nothing in return. Nobody guaranteed them anything afterwards. No house, no homestead, no piece of land, not even human companionship. Something unique happened here. In the most difficult of situations, a group of young people emerged, ready to sacrifice themselves for the common good rather than their own individual goals. A poet might call them unknown soldiers. Why? Because they wanted nothing for themselves. They didn't wait to be enlisted, they volunteered. They didn't wait for the nation to buy them arms, they paid for them. They didn't wait for induction orders. They went to war even before they were called.
December 1947. 3 days after the United Nations votes to partition Palestine and give the Jews a state, Arab riots sweep downtown Jerusalem. The city's Jews are helpless. A call goes out to the Palmach, the elite strike force of the Haganah.
I was at Kibbutz Na'an in what was called the reserves. Someone called me to the phone. There was only one. It was 8 or 9 in the morning. Yigal Alon was on the line telling me, "Menachem, a convoy to Jerusalem will pass by here in an hour." The convoys crossed the fields near Na'an. "Yoshua Globerman will wait for you. You're going to Jerusalem."
On just minutes' notice, university students and youth group members, the Palmach's reservists, streamed to Jewish Agency headquarters. Traffic in and out of the city must move in convoys. The young men and women of the Palmach will escort them, traveling back and forth along the winding road with hardly a Jewish outpost along it.
That's what things were like then. People were somehow more naive, more childlike. They believed that the fate of the Jewish community depended on them.
The story of a convoy at Shahe Guy, the mountainous gateway to the Jerusalem highway. A hail of bullets, the drivers pick up speed, a mine explodes. The roar of the engines grows louder. The heat in the trucks is murderous. Bullets drum against the armor. Horns blare. Tires hiss, pop, and die.
We stopped here, across from the Sheikh's tomb. Suddenly, on the side of the road, I see Nachum Hershkovitz crawling between the cars and directing the drivers to turn back toward the lower pump house. When I met him the next day, he didn't think he'd done anything special. He crawled under withering fire, telling driver after driver to turn back. He saved their lives.
Jerusalem's fate would be decided in its foothills by the convoys carrying food and arms. In this war, the front line was 6 yards wide, the width of the asphalt.
There was nothing tricky here. Families needed to feed their children, but there was no milk, eggs, food, or water. So the city fathers or the national council heads or someone would say, "Guys, we can't make it. There are dead and wounded, and there's no food." That's what it was like, a classic siege. We knew we held the keys to Jerusalem's survival. That's what everyone felt, every one of us. Are we any better than the people in Jerusalem? We were more than ready to die there.
A handful of fighters from the Palmach's 5th and 6th battalions escorted truck after truck, convoy after convoy, day after day. Food and more food, casualty after casualty.
I'd left my jacket at the house where I was staying, with a pack of cigarettes in the pocket. The house mother found them when she was cleaning up. And so this very respectable Jerusalem woman invited all her friends over to smoke my cigarettes. Fate and the Palmach helped us. Harel was operating along the highway. With heavy casualties and inhuman courage, they protected more than 70% of the provisions we were to receive. Without them, the city wouldn't have made it. It would have starved to death.
A radio message to Uzi in the Etzion block. Platoon departed Hartuv tonight, on way to you with explosives to blow up bridges. Message from Etzion block to Jerusalem. Reinforcements failed to arrive. Message to Etzion block. Hearing reports of a massacre.
We sat all night on the stairs of the Jewish Agency building and waited for word from them. When the sun rose and we still hadn't heard anything, we were very worried. We understood something terrible had happened.
On February 15th, 1948, 35 Palmach and Field Corps troops set out for the embattled, isolated Etzion block. They departed by night and should have arrived by morning. Hours later, word arrived. The 35 soldiers, Lamed Hay in Hebrew, had been trapped between Soref, Jabba, and Beit Natif, 3 Arab villages. They'd fought to the finish.
Here we were, 2 frightened girls, knocking on the door of an unfamiliar house and telling them that their son had fallen in battle, and then disappearing again, because we were still part of the underground. The parents listened without asking a question. They received the news with amazing dignity. I still wonder how they did that.
The poet Chaim Guri wrote, "Look, here lie our bodies all in a row. Our faces transformed, death stares from our eyes, without a whisper of breath. We did what we could until the last of us fell. Are we to blame if evening finds us dead, lips pressed to the rocky soil?"
The shock was even greater, because it wasn't just losing friends and weapons. It was losing access to the Etzion block, and that placed doubts on our ability to reach any isolated settlements.
The Etzion block settlements have been cut off from Jerusalem for several days. Early one Saturday at the end of March, a huge convoy of trucks and armored vehicles sets out for the block. Exploiting the element of surprise, they arrive unharmed. After unloading their cargo, they head back.
On the way to the block, it was already clear that something would happen. It was like the shadow of death. A terrible silence. No Arabs, no nothing.
And we're driving, and our stomachs hurt.
The scout plane informed us that Arab traffic between Hebron and Bethlehem had come to a halt, and that there were roadblocks near Bethlehem.
Near Bethlehem, the road is blocked. A fierce firefight erupts. They're surrounded by thousands of Arabs. In desperation, Zerubbabel Horowitz decides to blow up his armored car along with its wounded passengers, including himself. Only 3 people escape before he gives the order to detonate.
Even before we reached the road to the Etzion block, I'd come to grips with the idea that I'd never make it back alive. No, I didn't believe I'd make it. I thought no more than 5 or 10% would make it. I was completely apathetic. I stood a little farther off, and when I saw the house and heard shouts that there were casualties, I drove the armored car, flat tires and all, and approached as close as I could, and placed the explosives. I moved the car away, and then blew open the door of the house.
We went in, and we felt we were stepping on people on the ground, a lot of people. Everyone said, "Move." I said, "Make some room, I want to sit, I'm exhausted." So they say, "Sit on us, we're also sitting on other people." There was no room to move. There were more than 100 people inside the building.
The Arabs are approaching. The convoy survivors make their last stand in a small house on the road by Bethlehem. So close to Jerusalem, yet so far.
Then they began sniping into the corridor. People were scared to stand by the door. A driver next to me was hit. I thought he was wounded, but he was actually dead and bleeding excessively. People began fainting, and they all lay on top of me. "Medic," they shouted. I was just a girl.
Most of the convoy passengers are unarmed. The few with weapons fight throughout the day and night from the house and its roof, keeping the Arabs at bay. The Jewish community of Palestine can do nothing to save them. The British negotiate a ceasefire. The losses are tremendous in dead and wounded, in the very act of surrender, and the loss of most of the armored vehicles available for convoys to Jerusalem.
We fought the same Arabs all the time, and we kept our heads down because otherwise they would have eaten us alive. The fact of the matter is that they didn't give up until the very end.
The blockade is a week old. A huge convoy assembles at Hulda, ready to head for Jerusalem under cover of darkness. A Palmach force is deployed in the hills overlooking Shahe Guy. The convoy crawls along. The road turns muddy. As day breaks, thousands of local Arabs close in on them. Shots ring out from all sides. The convoy barely escapes back to Hulda.
The convoy met a terrible fate. Besides not getting through to Jerusalem, the last armored vehicle, carrying the wounded, was hit and exploded, and we lost all its passengers. The radio operator reported that Yoram Trevis was blowing up the armored car. I remember the picture. I remember Yoram too, an outstanding mathematician, a genius. Here you can feel how the fight for the road went on, for months and months, until it reached a dead end. We couldn't go on like that anymore.
The Arabs held the upper hand along the highways and in the cities, with a wave of urban terror. 3 huge explosions ripped through downtown Jerusalem, shattering morale. A bomb at the Jewish Agency building killed and wounded dozens and deepened the sense of helplessness. Around the world there were growing doubts about the ability of the Jews of Palestine to withstand the coming onslaught. It was fear for the fate of Jerusalem that gave birth to Operation Nachshon. In April 1948, 1,500 fighters were brought together and assigned their mission to reopen the road to Jerusalem. The Palmach, an underground militia, was taking the first step toward becoming an army. As if by fate, new arms arrived just in time for the attack. For the very first time, a genuine chain of command was in place. Through lack of choice, the Jewish fighters changed their strategy from defense to offense.
I joined the Haganah at the age of 14. We'd practice breaking down weapons in the dark and diving to the ground on the floor of a Tel Aviv schoolroom. This was supposed to prepare us to help determine the fate of our country. And here, during Operation Nachshon, all of a sudden a brigade was being assembled in broad daylight, with bases scattered between Na'an and Hulda. The operation was planned like make-believe, as if the British weren't here. We take over the road, conquer villages. Nowadays, it doesn't sound like much, but this was the first time in 2,000 years that Jews had conquered a village.
The Kastel loomed over the Jerusalem highway like a symbol of fear. The sounds of the city could be heard from here. Nearby Arab villages housed a considerable fighting force. But on April 2nd, a Palmach company captured the Kastel with relative ease and turned it over to the Field Corps. While the Arabs considered the historic and military significance of the Kastel's fall, its Jewish defenders were gripped by exhaustion, out of strength and out of ammunition. In most battles, the Arabs drew fighters from near their villages. One of the very few who managed to train an organized military force was Abdul Khadir Husseini. Charisma and military knowledge helped him amass large numbers of Arabs to throw against objectives held by small numbers of Jews. When Abdul Khadir heard that the Kastel had been taken, he considered the precedent too dangerous to ignore. On April 8th, he set out to recapture it. He was killed in the assault.
They began at night at 8 o'clock. Until 12, they shelled us with 81mm mortars and medium machine guns and incendiary bombs. It was hellish. Before dawn, it got very quiet. Suddenly we saw 3 figures approaching battalion headquarters. When they were very close, Mayor Carmel called to them, "Yalla ya Jama," and they answered, "Hello, boys." Within a split second, everyone knew something was wrong. "Mayor," I said, "Mayor, they're not ours," and he pulled the trigger. The one in the middle fell. He was about 15 yards from the door. The other 2 jumped off the terrace, slipped through the fences, and disappeared.
The Palmach and Field Corps forces defending the Kastel are unaware of Abdul Khadir's death. At 10 in the morning, they face a massive Arab attack.
At one point, as I moved from position to position, I captured a machine gun nest, and we really cut them down, but they didn't stop. It was impossible to stop them. They moved like this. We didn't understand. They'd taken tremendous casualties, but they still wouldn't stop.
By noon, word reaches Kiryat Anavim of serious trouble at the Kastel. The commander of the 4th Battalion puts together an improvised force led by Nahum Arieli.
When they arrived here, they found most of the village held by Arabs. Only 3 houses, including this one, were still in the hands of the defenders. The Field Corps troops and the Palmach. They were already dead and wounded, and the Arabs were attacking in waves. One wave would fall and another would take its place.
The order is given to retreat, an order forever etched in memory. Enlisted men fall back. Commanders cover their retreat.
The officers will cover the enlisted men as they withdraw. It was the first time anyone had heard of anything like it. In all other armies, the enlisted men, the lower ranks, are the ones who go forward, who charge, who do the dirty work. Here, among the people of Israel, for the first time in history, as far as we know, a dedicated fighter named Shimon Al-Fassi decided to do something different. You had to respect him. That order was a natural reflection of his personality. On the way to battle, all of us would take a hand grenade to use if things got desperate. Shimon used his. About half the troops who went out without force never made it back. We'd lost a vital asset, and we felt we hadn't had to. I'm no poet, but I remember Rachamim Yagan, for example, who grabbed me by the leg and said, "Get me out, get me out." He was badly wounded in both legs. A big guy, a baker. His words still ring in my ears, his and those of the others who screamed, "Help us get out, don't leave us." But I had to. I could only carry one.
After retaking the Castel, the Arabs carry the body of their beloved Abdul Khader back to Jerusalem for a hero's funeral. But the death of their leader, the pace of the fighting, and their heavy casualties break their spirit. Exhausted, its dead strewn across the hillside, the Palmach's 4th Battalion sets out that same night to conquer the Castel once and for all.
I remember that inspection. People were so exhausted that they couldn't stand, and afterwards we had to move out on foot. What I remember especially is how Yosefle and Benny breathed new life into those soldiers. He explained how the fate of Jerusalem depended on securing the Castel, that if we couldn't retake and hold the Castel, Jerusalem was in jeopardy.
Immediately after taking the Castel in Operation Nachshon, the 4th Battalion captures Kolonia across from Motza and dynamites its buildings. They report back to headquarters. The Jerusalem road is open. In several places between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, the Jews now enjoy territorial continuity. This was to be one of the greatest achievements of Israel's War of Independence. As a result, Jerusalem would lay within the borders of the new Jewish state.
We didn't think in terms of conquering a village, expelling its residents, killing them, and taking their place. From a military point of view, that might have been the most logical thing to do with perhaps the fewest casualties. Destroying a village without killing women and children was a compromise measure, but they evidently felt compelled to adopt it. It was a revolutionary idea that few had thought of before that.
April 12, 1948. The 4th Battalion, along with the 5th and what remains of the 6th, are grouped together to form the Harel Brigade. With the Castel subdued, attention turns to Saris, a hostile village that has claimed considerable Jewish lives. Squad Commander Amos Kinamon, a survivor of the fight for the Castel, goes forth to do battle at Saris, together with a volunteer officer from Canada.
He was right next to me. He said, "Wait a second, tell me, where's the holding fire, the tanks and the artillery? How does all this work?" I had no idea what he was talking about. My English was pretty bad, but I tried to explain. So he said, "Okay, I'll go with you. I want to see what's happening." And that's what Ra'anana meant about the power of a hand-to-hand battle.
The 4th Battalion conquers Saris with a combination of blocking and assault forces. Their tactics: forced marches by night, a clandestine approach to the objective, and a surprise attack from short range.
We'd been trained for this by the Palmach. We didn't ask questions. I'd left a wife and daughter behind. No one was paying her my salary. I had no idea how she was getting by. To tell the truth, I never thought about it.
Throughout the war, Jerusalem was tortured by fear, by killing, sniping, shelling, and hunger. People were so thirsty that even artillery barrages couldn't scare them into losing their places in the water lines. Life came to a standstill. Those who were drafted disappeared from their homes. Many others hid themselves and their families in basements and bomb shelters. The streets were empty. Only the footsteps of the soldiers could be heard. Winter chilled the air. People traveled from one neighborhood to another at risk of death. The Jewish quarters were islands in a sea of Arabs. The fate of Mount Scopus now lay in the hands of the British. They controlled the access road leading through Sheikh Jarrah. On April 13, 1948, 2 days after a massacre of Arabs at Deir Yassin, a Jewish convoy set out for Hadassah Hospital, located atop the mountain.
As they fired, the Arabs shouted, "Deir Yassin, Deir Yassin, Deir Yassin." That's all we heard.
At 9:30 a.m., the convoy reaches Sheikh Jarrah. Several hundred Arabs are deployed on either side of the road. A mine explodes. The first armored car comes to a halt. Hand grenades are thrown. 2 busloads of Jews are trapped on the road. Only the rear guard manages to retreat.
I was right here when they threw a grenade, and the whole car went. The brakes, the booster, the steering wheel, and the tires, because it wasn't armored. There was a small hole they'd once thought to glass over, but never had. Through that small hole, I saw a place to turn around. I turned around and drove away with no tires, no brakes, no oil, and no water.
Several dozen yards away, the Jewish residents of Beit Yisrael and the Haganah fighters based there look on helplessly. The British let the massacre continue.
They were burned alive. Alive. Everything burned. You can see all these remained in the armored cars and buses they were in. Everyone was crying, just like me. I couldn't stop. To this day, when I remember that God was with me from childhood.
78 people are killed. Doctors and nurses and hospital workers burned to death. Only a handful survive. The annihilation of the Hadassah convoy sparks a wave of fury and desperation. Jerusalem is gripped by a sense of defeat. One report says the British have pulled out of the city center in preparation for evacuating Jerusalem altogether. Against this background, the Harel Brigade is ordered to Jerusalem. The Palmach and Harel request permission to first secure the Jerusalem road, but under pressure from the Jerusalem command, that request is denied. They will move out the next morning. On April 20th, a huge convoy sets out from Hulda, 300 supply vehicles, escorted by the 5th Battalion.
At the head of the convoy were David Ben-Gurion, Yitzhak Sadeh, and Fritz Eisenstadt. But they'd already reached Jerusalem. When the people of Jerusalem saw such a convoy and its Palmach troops entering the city, the feeling was unbelievable.
When the head of the convoy reaches Jerusalem, its tail is still at Shahe Guy. The Arabs take up positions in the hills, bring in hundreds of reinforcements, and open fire. Vehicles are hit, drivers abandon them.
The scene was horrible. Soldiers and damaged vehicles laying in the ditches, and some of the girls too.
Only someone who's tried advancing under enemy fire knows how hard it is to conquer fear. As Dr. Issachar put it, to force yourself to ignore the lure of the ground and move ahead. One of the fighters tried jumping from his trench and immediately took a bullet. "Leave me alone," he shouted to the doctor, "or you'll get hit too. I'm done for."
It was terrible. We're lying here on the road. They're shooting from both sides and everything is blocked. The wounded are shouting. The ditches are full of our dead. The cars are burning. And at any minute we're expecting them to assault us from both sides of the road.
We made our way slowly up the hillside. Yoska was ahead of me, gasping for breath. The second he stood up, he took a bullet in the throat and fell without a sound.
I decided to try to get past the ambush. Itty and I move out and they keep shooting at us for about 1.5 kilometers. Itty fires a submachine gun, shouts to all our troops to open fire, and miraculously we weren't hit. I joined up with Yosifla and came back with a company from the 4th Battalion, with 2 armoured cars we'd stolen from the British, to rescue the convoy. I jumped onto a sort of step here and held on, and when we got around the curve, I heard the pack of bullets hitting the armour. I lay down on the fender where it was wider. Suddenly, in this middle of the road, I saw one of our dead, lying face down, all covered in red. I don't know what motivated me, but I raised my hand as if... I don't know what. I touched him, and we drove on. At the lower pump house, the shooting stopped. Before too long, a force arrived from the direction of Jerusalem, the 4th Battalion. By dusk, the convoy had been rescued. The brigade went up to Jerusalem, and the road was closed. The brigade had been badly hurt. We'd lost about 20 cars and 20 men, including a platoon commander, a company commander, squad commanders and soldiers.
Harel had lost 4 precious days due to inaccurate reports of a British pullout from Jerusalem. Despite this, they reached an historic decision to conquer and liberate the city. Operation Yevusi, under the command of Palmach founder Yitzhak Sadeh. The plan was to block the entrances to the city from Nebi Samuel, Augusta Victoria, and Ramat Rachel, thus surrounding Jerusalem on all sides.
I'm an old man now, but every time I approach Jerusalem, I get furious.
Nebi Samuel is the first objective. The 4th Battalion prepares for a night attack, but things go wrong. Beit Iksa, the first village, is subdued, but the armored vehicles are unable to pass through it to support the main thrust. The order to withdraw is given. And then, against all military logic and Palmach tactics, the Poznansky platoon launches its assault using nighttime formations in broad daylight. In a single volley of fire, a small force of Arab fighters kills all the commanders, leaving the troops to retreat in panic.
Why did it fail? I wanted to see if there were ghosts. And if not, then what did we do wrong? The inquiry showed that there were no ghosts. In that battle, we simply screwed up and paid the price. Not because they were smarter than us, or surprised us, or were braver than us, but simply because we hadn't operated according to the plan of battle. We learned an important lesson. It couldn't bring back the dead, but it gave new hope for the living.
Kiryat Anavim and Ma'aleh HaChamisha served as the base for the 4th Battalion and later for the entire Harel Brigade. Kiryat Anavim was already a veteran kibbutz several decades old. The kibbutzniks watched the youthful fighters go out to battle and saw them return. After the Battle of Nebi Samuel, they counted 38 dead and 40 wounded. It was almost Passover.
For almost an entire day, they collected the bodies from the slopes between Radar Hill and the Pfefferman House. Hannah Yoffe, a medic and an administrative officer, was in the field all day long. She arrived in the evening with her khakis covered in blood, a broad-shouldered girl with a beautiful face, all covered in blood. Must have taken all the spiritual strength she had to withstand the horrors of collecting those bodies. As she walked into the clerk's office, a room or two from here, sitting down in her bloody khakis, she burst into tears. But I don't remember us crying. It's very... It was the eve of Passover. It was one of the saddest holidays we'd ever known. Someone tried to start a song. Somewhere they found a bottle of wine, and we passed a glass around. We sat in the dark because of the blackout. It was a very sad holiday.
Harel tries a different plan, conquering Arab neighborhoods in Jerusalem's outskirts to create a continuous belt of Jewish settlement, this in advance of the expected Arab invasion after Israel's declaration of independence. Harel moves into Sheikh Jarrah. In a brilliant operation, it captures the lower tier of houses and dynamites them. But the most important building of all, the Nashashibi house, remains standing.
We took the first and second floors easily enough, but there were still snipers on the roof.
At daybreak, a jeep arrives carrying 2 British soldiers and an ultimatum. The Jews must abandon the house by 6 o'clock. In return, the British will remove the Arab snipers. The British reasoning, Sheikh Jarrah is a crucial intersection on the route of their planned evacuation. No one else can control it. The Palmach response? No surrender. They refuse and wait for the British reaction.
Until 6 in the evening, nothing happened. But after dark, we heard an armored vehicle and saw a tank, or 2 or more, and troop carriers and infantry soldiers. There they were, showing us that they meant business.
The tanks are moving and shooting, and the British are charging. One British soldier was killed, and our force was scattered, and I don't know where.
Brigade Commander Yitzhak Rabin is worried. He asked to accompany the British force commander to the action zone to find his troops.
The British battalion commander agrees, but he asks, how will they recognize us? So I say, I'll go up there with you. Then he says, but there's no room for you in the tank or the Bren carrier. You can sit on top of the tank. It's already dark. We can't see anything, he says. I tell him they have searchlights. We're not responsible if you fall, he says. We'll be driving fast. I tell him it's okay. We set out in a convoy, driving along Sheikh Jarrah, up to Mount Scopus. I radioed ahead to tell them not to open fire on the British, that the British aren't attacking Mount Scopus again. So I ride on the tank, holding on for dear life. Zivi Tsafriri comes down with most of the force. We hugged and kissed because we never thought we'd see each other again. The British kept their word. They never let the Arabs re-enter Sheikh Jarrah. When the British evacuated, we took Sheikh Jarrah without a fight.
The conquest of Sheikh Jarrah left a lasting impression on the Arabs. They fled, leaving only their fighters behind. But while Harel was busy in the city, the road to the coast was unprotected. Once again, Jerusalem was under siege.
And then they told us, we're heading back to Kiryat Anavim, to the battalion tent camp at Ma'aleh HaChamisha. We're resupplying and going to Jerusalem. Until then, Passover Eve 1948, I'd spent the whole war without once being in Jerusalem. Together with the company commanders, I went from soldier to soldier, sitting on their mattresses. There were no beds, waking them, telling them about Jerusalem and such. Some were sound asleep. We shook them one by one and explained that they had to get up, even though they hadn't slept in weeks. What happened at Nebi Samuel happened, we told them. Now we had to fight again. Soon the entire battalion was on the trucks, ready to move out. Jerusalem had the air of a city under siege. Everything was empty, nothing moved. Artillery shells were falling. Passing by the Jewish Agency building, if they hadn't built a wall there, you could have been shot from the old city walls. The entire city was riddled with bullets. People were scared to leave their homes. It was a ghost town, a town with death in the air. In Jerusalem, no one was moving. When we entered the city, we tried to raise morale. We'd purposely get off the trucks and enter on foot. All over town, people emerged from their rooms, their nooks and crannies. The Palmach is here, the Palmach is here. In all our wars, this was the only time we ever had a city truly under siege. 70 or 80,000 Jews, women, children and babies. Jerusalem under siege.
The stately homes of the Arab Katamon neighborhood stood between southern Jerusalem and the center of the city. The San Simone Monastery was the key to taking Katamon, a towering structure that overlooked its surroundings. After fighting at Nebi Samuel, the 4th Battalion twice attempted to capture San Simone. Taking the entrance by night was relatively easy, but on the following day, the fighters faced their first ever daylight defensive battle.
We saw what the situation was, and we set out for the kibbutz, for an officer's field briefing to decide how to organize for the day. As we passed through the door, the Arabs opened fire. Benny had a Sten gun. "I'm returning fire," he said, but the bullet was a dud. His gun jammed. So I went out with my Tommy gun and faced them from a range of not more than 8 or 10 meters. Meanwhile, Ori and Dado ran up to the roof to throw grenades. I stood there with the Tommy gun, but it wasn't so simple shooting at people just 8 meters away from me. It wasn't so simple. There were lots of snipers shooting at us. They came so close that Uri went up to the roof to throw grenades at them, right? They were already at the building. I had to go to the roof. I kept going up there and they passed me grenades. I made it rain grenades. I came through here for several counterattacks. I'd pass through the dispensary and ask, "Guys, who can help?" And a few would get up, wounded and healthy alike. We would go out, counterattack face to face, and then come back. On one attack, Raful came with me. As we passed this stone wall, we came upon a nest of Arabs. They were trying to sneak through a hole in the wall in order to penetrate the monastery. We ran right into them. During the assault, we shot and killed anyone in range, a meter or 2 or 3. The others scattered and fled. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw an Arab lying behind a rock, right here. Before I could raise my gun, he shot me. I took a bullet in the head and fell to the ground. Then Dado and someone else dragged me back through that hole in the wall into the monastery. We carried him to the building. He regained consciousness and they bandaged him, but he refused to lie down. He took up a position at the window and went on shooting. There was a table in the room. They put a chair on it and they sat me on the chair with a rifle, and my job was not to let anyone get past the wall. I remember a guy named Aryeh Chaikin who was badly wounded here and died downstairs afterwards. He did a great job here throwing grenades. At a certain point, he got hit. I went up to the roof to get him, but he was in very bad shape. He didn't want to be a burden. He turned around. How, I don't know. And with that blood clotted all over him, he rubbed his wounds until they reopened. And he simply bled to death. This roof was hit by mortar fire. The whole monastery was surrounded by machine guns. There were constant charges through breaks in the stone walls. We weren't sure we could hold on, but we were sure that if we didn't, our wounded were done for. They were sniping into this window. A machine gun stood right over there. One of us was killed. Someone else took his place. He was killed too. And someone else took his place. That happened 3 or 4 times. So if you ask whether it was rough here, yes, it was rough. You have 30 fit men left. The rest are all dead or wounded. You're out of food and bandages and medicine, out of ammunition. And you start wondering, maybe you won't make it. It was then that we decided that if it looked like we were done for and that they were about to take the monastery, we'd send the fit men to the rear, leave several commanders behind with the badly wounded, and blow up the building with ourselves inside. And whatever happens, happens. There were several medics in the monastery, but the medic was Avraham Keller, a Holocaust survivor. He faced a situation I wouldn't wish on anyone. At Auschwitz, he'd been through the selection, where one lives and the other dies. One goes to work and the other to the gas chambers. And here, when we decided to blow up our badly wounded, we told him, tell us who has no chance of making it and who can walk. Suddenly, this Holocaust survivor finds himself forced to decide who will live and who will die. We removed the wounded to the courtyard, telling them it was so the rooms could be cleaned. We planted explosives under the mattresses and then put the wounded back in bed. And then something happened that sometimes does happen in battle. Both sides were in difficult straits. The battle was fierce. Casualties were very heavy. The question was, who would break first? In this case, they did. I knew we had no choice but to go back empty-handed. It simply doesn't work. We have to take Katamon. There's no other way. No other way to save Jerusalem. I knew Ra'anana and Duri Ben-Ari. I knew them. What do you mean? That you could trust them? Yes. Because these are people who can be trusted? Yes, I was certain. Look, they'd lost almost a third of their men and were still game. They wouldn't say no after losing just 2 men. They left here with about 70% of their men wounded, and with other wounded dragging them along. During the battle, we were unaware of the magnitude of the outcome. We knew how important the battle for Katamon was, but we had no idea it would result in linking together all of South Jerusalem. We had no idea.
The conquest of Katamon altered the balance in Jerusalem. In the days ahead, the High Command would send in Harel whenever the situation was critical, whether in Jerusalem or at Shahe Guy. The brigade would be deployed back and forth, from the Jewish quarter to Ramat Rachel, from Sheikh Jarrah to the Jerusalem highway. 200 died, 300 were wounded. Almost half the brigade would not live out the war. "I don't even want to think," said one historian, "what the outcome would have been had not Harel come to the rescue of Jerusalem." May 1948. Of all the months of warfare in Jerusalem, this was the most trying. A suffocating blockade. No food, no ammunition. The soldiers exhausted, the shelling continuous, casualties mounting. Could Jerusalem survive?
"420 civilians were killed, and nearly 2,000 wounded. For a city of 100,000, that's a tremendous figure. On top of that, some 1,000 soldiers were killed within the city limits. There were no supplies, no food, and the city was on the brink of collapse. What's the meaning of collapse? It's when people go out with white flags, as they did in the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood of Mea Shearim. If one neighborhood surrenders, others may follow. It's like a snowball.
Harel is back on the road. Its earlier victories have secured the highway from Jerusalem to Saris, today called Shoresh. The brigade's next objective, the high ground overlooking the road. Thousands of Arabs from Beit Maksir village take up positions on the heights, intent on blocking the entrance to Shahe Guy, the gateway to the Jerusalem highway.
The entire road was blocked with huge boulders. I don't know where they found them. Tons of rocks filling the road.
Local Arabs rushed to Beit Maksir, joined by the Arab Liberation Army. The Haganah High Command wires orders to Harel, take Beit Maksir at all costs.
The village of Beit Maksir supplied the troops who blocked the road. Taking Beit Maksir meant opening the road.
Hidden by heavy fog, Harel's 5th Battalion ascends the heights around Beit Maksir, allowing the 4th Battalion to take the village itself without interference.
We dug in with our fingernails and ascended like rock climbers, dragging gear on all fours. Here you can reach the end of a terrace, but there they were endless. We held on to bushes. Time after time, the head of the column would fall back, and the rest of us would break their fall. Then we'd start climbing all over again, in this thick fog.
After 6 hours of climbing, recalls Iska Shadmi, a wind came up, and the fog lifted like a curtain.
There's vegetation here now because there are goats grazing, but back then it was bare. It was thick with Arabs. They ran right up and left us alone. They only sniped at us. Suddenly we heard screams and shouting, and from this flank appeared an Arab Legion sergeant, followed by dozens of Arab fighters. When the sergeant was about 5 meters from here, he was hit by a burst of fire from Yoab or me, and was killed. And then they all ran back. That attack failed, but they mounted another 3. That's the only time in the entire War of Independence that I saw them reach one of our command posts. In fact, it's the only time I saw action like that, with hand grenades and pistols. The 2 who were killed were just a couple of meters from where I was with the field radio. It was real face-to-face combat. We didn't retreat. We held on in broad daylight. But we couldn't dig in because they were constantly sniping at us. And Yitzhak told me, "You are holding the chance." That's what he called it. The chance of opening the highway, opening it tomorrow night.
Because it considers the battle crucial, the Haganah Command commits the heaviest aircraft in the Jewish arsenal, a Piper Cub, carrying a 500-pound barrel of explosives.
I contacted them and their radio operator told me, "We're above the target. We see them. We're going to drop the barrel." I wished him luck, and just as we finished talking, the plane suddenly dived. Like this, and went down in smoke.
The plane's crew was killed, but Harel hit its target. After 2 attempts at reaching the base of Beit Machzir village under cover of darkness, came a third.
Modka, stop. Moti, advance. Moti, cover Ashkenazi. Ashkenazi, advance. Shouted orders. We heard them just fine, and that's how it went till we reached the top. We must have fought for 2 hours to reach the top. I don't think there was ever such a long, stubborn assault in the entire War of Independence.
Beit Machzir had fallen, but the battle was far from over. The enemy refused to give up. They charged, fired artillery, then charged again. Yet the 5th Battalion gave no ground.
There were difficult days. People were depressed, talking about dying. Today you, tomorrow me. It was like the Warsaw Ghetto, fatalistic. When Iska Shadmi wanted to console the Sappers, he'd say, Mishka, idi suda, in Russian. Mishka, come here. And he'd say, what do you mean there are no people like that? Millions will come. It would raise everyone's spirits. They treated us new immigrants so well that I still want to cry when I think of it. I was taken directly to Auschwitz and stayed there until 1945. After surviving Auschwitz, why did you want to join the Palmach? Because it was the elite unit of the Haganah. But why didn't you say, wait a minute, I've done my part. Let someone else fight now. Why should I face death again? No, I couldn't. For me, it was a challenge. When Raful handed me my first rifle, I kissed him. For me, that was really something.
The battle for the Jerusalem Road resulted in heavy casualties and led to the establishment of the Palmach's first improvised field hospital at the Abu Ghosh Monastery above Kiryat Anavim.
We had equipment but no water. We took water from the well and boiled it to sterilize the surgical instruments.
I lost 25 pounds while we were under siege here. It wasn't from lack of food, but from too much work.
There was a boy named Evyatar Perlmutter. I'll never forget him. He was 16, a child. He was wounded. They brought him in here with both legs crushed. I remember how he slowly drifted into shock. We didn't have anything to bring him around. I stood by him for hours. And then he said, "My parents will be destroyed. They tried like crazy to get me out of the army, but it didn't work. I'll go to Jerusalem. I'll liberate Jerusalem, me and my friends." And then he slipped into a coma and died.
From the high ground overlooking Shahe Guy, the troops of Harel could hear the sounds of battle in the Etzion block. Thousands of Arab villagers, along with armored cars from the Arab Legion and help from British artillery, were attacking the Jewish settlements. That day, even without benefit of anti-tank weapons, the attack was repelled, but casualties were heavy.
12 of our friends were killed. At the funeral, David Ben David, the Etzion block's explosives expert, warned us to be careful on the narrow path to the cemetery. Careful, there's a mine there and here. When finally we got there, we put down the stretchers. I'll never forget how the commander of the block pointed at the bodies and then at us and said, "What is life? Life is nothing. Everything is nothing. But Jerusalem is eternal. Jerusalem must be watched over. Jerusalem must be defended. We were all young, around 20, and what he said should have made us feel bad. Later he said, "Remember, we'll make it out of here, but we'll never abandon the Etzion block. We're not leaving here." We heard what he said, but we never panicked. We were on our way back to Masuot, where we were based. When we arrived, we drank arak from the monastery. We got drunk and danced. I don't know where they found a record player and records. I don't remember. But we drank and danced and felt terrible. We felt awful.
Harel was powerless to help. They could hear the battle raging, but endless days and nights of combat had left them exhausted, and the blockade had left them famished. The terrain was forbidding. Their friends were dying and wounded, and they were lonely as only 18-year-olds can be. It was up to them to hold fast, to seize independence from the jaws of massacre.
Suddenly, boom! Someone grabs my shoulders and shouts, "Yosefle, Yosefle, it's Benny Marshak. Yosefle, do you hear me?" I say, "What happened, Benny?" He says, "They're attacking the Etzion block. They're attacking, do you hear? The block is about to surrender." So I told him, "Benny, we can't take part in that battle." "How can you lay here and sleep?" he asked. "Because," I told him, "we have a battle of our own to fight tonight."
Here at Kiryat Anavim, I could pick up the radio transmissions from the Etzion block, but Jerusalem couldn't, so I relayed the information to them. I had a big logbook where I wrote it all down. The Yellow Hill's been taken. The Carib Hill has fallen. Moshe's dead. We have hundreds of wounded. We're pulling back. I had it all in writing. You see what we received. It would usually come in code, and then I'd decode it. But there was no time to send code during the battle for the Etzion block, so it was all in the clear.
After surrendering to the Arab Legion, many of the Etzion block's Jewish defenders had been massacred, so the 3 remaining Etzion settlements kept on fighting, agreeing to surrender only under the auspices of the Red Cross. 357 fighters were packed off to a Jordanian prison.
Never mind that the weapons were worthless, the Sten guns and all. To stack them up was terribly humiliating. It was humiliating to lay down our arms, worthless or not. We were the last to leave. I remember how they took us off in trucks. As we left the block, Revadim and Ein Tzurim were in flames. As we left Masuot, where observant Jewish families lived, we saw Sabbath candles were burning in the windows. People were lighting candles. I'll never forget that. Sabbath candles in the middle of the war.
The entire front was ablaze. Jerusalem was fighting for its life. The Etzion block had surrendered, and at Shahe Guy, the Harel Brigade was fighting along the north side of the highway. Kaokji's Arab Liberation Army launched its assault.
For reinforcements, they gave me a youth company. I remember it as one of my worst moments of the war. They were 16-year-olds. During the battle for the fortifications, I sent them to Menachem. An artillery barrage began just as they moved off. About half were wounded. I don't remember how many died. I felt terrible. They were children, 15 or 16 years old. If I learned anything from the battles for Jerusalem, it was that I'd never again be party to any war like the War of Independence. If anything kept me in the army, it was the question, how had we not seen what would happen? How had we not prepared for the worst? There was never a more terrible war than the War of Independence. I remember those boys and girls, kids of barely 17 or 18, showing up with nothing but dry flowers and poetry. I have nothing against poems or flowers, but to be put in that situation without proper equipment or ammunition to set out that way for Jerusalem? On May the 14th, I was in one of these rooms. We'd come back here after 5 days of fighting. Someone turned on the radio, and there was Ben-Gurion declaring the establishment of the State of Israel. And I listened from some distance, and some tired soldier said, "Turn it off. We're dying to sleep. We'll hear it tomorrow." The daily routine was like this. You'd go to sleep at 6 or 6:30 in the morning, sleep till 12, go to the officers' briefing at headquarters, eat lunch, and go to a funeral, every day. Sometimes your troops would also dig the graves. Then you'd go to dinner, and then march off to wherever, and it went on like that for 3 months. Harel set standards of what was doable and what wasn't. The words absolutely impossible didn't exist. Really, everything was possible. You had to take a hill with the platoon? All right. If there was no platoon, you take it with a company.
On May 15th, the Arab armies invade Israel. The Arab Legion, the strongest of the forces, approaches Jerusalem in 2 columns. One heads towards Ramallah, Latrun, and the Jerusalem foothills, while the other lays siege to Jerusalem itself. With the Jordanians joining the battle, the Arabs instantly gain an additional 10,000 fighters.
The Legion had well-trained battalions of fully armed, fresh soldiers, with artillery and armor. We had tired troops who'd been fighting for half a year. All we had to block the Legion was our bodies.
In Old Jerusalem's besieged Jewish quarter, 100 Jewish defenders face 600 local Arabs. The impending arrival of the Arab Legion will eliminate any hope for the quarter's survival. Despite the old city's symbolic importance, the Jerusalem command accords the Jewish quarter no special preference. It has the fate of all Jerusalem to consider. The day after Israel declares its independence, the Arabs launch their attack. Panic grips the Jewish quarter. People run for cover. They huddle weeping in basements. It falls to the children to urge on the fighters and their own parents.
I run into a 12-year-old boy, shout at him, "Mordechai, what are you doing here? They're shooting here." And he says, "But Moshe, I'm the number 2 man on the machine gun." We had 1 machine gun, which we moved throughout the Jewish quarter. It was our only support. And this 12-year-old boy, Mordechai Mizrahi, says he's number 2 on the gun. What could I say? We had no one else.
May 18th. After 3 days of fighting, the Arabs overrun the Jewish quarter's lines of defense. Memories of the Etzion block massacre hang in the air.
An artillery shell that landed by their door wounded both of them. My father was killed on the spot. I sat down by my mother. Then I had to go out to do something, and by the time I came back, she was gone.
Orenstein's 13-year-old sister, a radio operator, looks at her dead parents, looks at her brother, the fighter, and smiles to lift his spirits.
For years, she didn't cry. She saw her dead parents and didn't cry. She couldn't allow herself to cry. I understand her.
The Jewish quarter is on the verge of collapse. Jerusalem City Commander David Shaltiel tells the Harel command, launch a diversionary attack on Mount Zion, while we break into the Jewish quarter through the Jaffa Gate and David's Tower. Harel's reply, you'll never make it. We have a better plan. If we attack Arab Jerusalem beyond the walls and take control of vital intersections, the entire old city will fall.
He says, I don't need your advice. Are you ready to help me with the diversion or not? We got angry at one another. Yosefle set off for Jerusalem. I told him, listen, Jerusalem is bigger than both of us. If that's what you want, there'll be diversion.
Shaltiel goes ahead with his own plan. The attack on David's Tower is an immediate failure, but the Palmach's 4th Battalion manages to take Mount Zion. This creates an opportunity to enter the Jewish quarter through the Zion Gate.
On the spot, I composed an order of the day. It has been 2,000 years since Jewish soldiers last mounted the walls of Jerusalem. Good luck and Godspeed. The plan for breaking in was that 2 sappers would set a 40-kilogram charge beneath this gate, a big iron gate. The sappers ran forward, set a charge with a delay, and returned to the main force. After it detonated, I shouted, "Forward!" But the force didn't move. It turned out that people had fallen asleep, and even the explosion hadn't awakened them. When we finally woke them, the first squad, 10 people, ran forward, took the gate, and then the rest of the force entered the old city.
Suddenly we heard shouting, the Palmach is here. There was never such a happy night. For us, the Palmach symbolized courage and valor and bravery, and we knew that if the Palmach had reached the quarter, we had nothing to fear.
We advanced along 2 axes. One here past these shops with some of the fighters moving on the roofs, and another along the walls, with the troops climbing up the ramparts and guiding our right flank. We secured the whole street that way, and then the force moved in along it. It was as if the Messiah had arrived. The Messiah has come just when we thought all was lost.
Following the Palmach breakthrough, the Jewish quarter commander expects reinforcements, but the Jerusalem command sends in non-combatants instead, 60 members of the field corps hardly fit for battle.
One of them told me how they'd been rounded up. Someone had gone from position to position. You, what are you doing now? I'm standing watch. Never mind, you'll be home by evening. They didn't tell them where they were going. They'd never met their commander before, or each other. Each one was given a rifle. With how much ammunition, I do not know. I still remember their big steel helmets from the British Navy. I had a chance to talk with most of the guys later. Among these so-called soldiers, these kids from the field corps, were people who'd first handled a rifle about half an hour before they were ordered into the old city. Dado was still there at first light. He later told me, "I stayed there with 22 troops and with orders to hold part of Mount Zion and the segment leading to the old city. I reached the conclusion that my people had already been fighting for 3 days, and I decided to pull back. I think that he was right. We couldn't have held on. That doesn't absolve him of anything. I was taught that you never abandon a position, and they did. If they'd stuck us with defensive missions, nothing would have happened here. Nothing. Take Katamon, take Mount Zion, take the Castle, take Beit Marsir. There were 2 sorry battalions here, and respectable remnants of the 4th and 5th battalions, and the survivors of the 3rd Company from the Etzion block, the Nebi Daniel convoy, and the Jerusalem convoys. They were the only units that went on the offensive, in the style of the future Israeli army. They won the Jerusalem corridor and what we have in Jerusalem itself. How could we have done it otherwise?
With a reinforcement safely inside the Jewish quarter, the Palmach pulls back from the Zion gate and the Arab siege is renewed. The Arabs now stand just 5 yards from the synagogue. The residents of the quarter fear for their lives. A huge fire engulfs the street of the Jews. Buildings collapse. Screams of the wounded fill the air. A huge explosion destroys the Churva synagogue. In one outpost, only 5 bullets remain.
We saw what we had left, in terms of personnel and equipment, and we understood that we couldn't hold out. I brought the Legion commander, Major Abdallah, here to hand over our fighters who, according to the agreement, were to be taken prisoner. There were about 30 of them, foot-weary, exhausted, tired, broken, dirty, and unshaven. And when he saw those poor devils, he told me, "What? These are all the fighters? This is what caused me so many losses?"
The terms of surrender are set with the commander of the Arab Legion. 600 children, along with women, old people, and serious casualties, are sent back to Jewish Jerusalem. The others, including a scattering of fighters, are taken prisoner.
The Jewish quarter managed to hold off the Arab Legion for 16 days. That's a fact, a military and historical fact.
The Arab Legion and its armored cars spread fear and terror throughout the city, but within 2 days the Youth Battalion and the Field Corps managed to block the Jordanian armor within Jerusalem, and Harel stops it on the way from Radar Hill to Ma'aleh HaChamisha.
Their armor-piercing rounds passed right through the Pfefferman house. Their forces were approaching. I let them come and sent a squad to where the woods are now. It was rocky ground. The squad reached their flank. The lay of the land made it possible to get very close. They reached the road and then stormed the first armored cars and threw Molotov cocktails at them. The fact that they did all this in daylight made it unique.
For 2 weeks, Jerusalem has been living in death, so writes Yeshurun Schatz in his diary. Life alternates between fear and anxiety and a sense of if only the horror has passed, if only we can hear the voice of hope knocking at the door. How long can we hold on living in death? From its hilltop location, Kibbutz Ramat Rachel overlooks southern Jerusalem. In May 1948, it changes hands 3 times. The air is thick with the smoke of fires ignited by artillery shells. An armored car full of reinforcements is wiped out before it can reach the embattled kibbutz. Other fighters witness the scene, panic, and flee. The corpses of attacking Arabs bear silent testimony to a terrible battle.
Ziama Aran and Moshe Kol, two members of the Jewish Agency executive who remained in Jerusalem, came to me and said, "The situation in southern Jerusalem is grave. We need the Palmach. Southern Jerusalem is about to fall, and half of Ramat Rachel is in the hands of the Muslim Brothers, the Egyptian volunteers. Our people are fleeing Ramat Rachel and Arnona." And I told them, "I have orders to pull out." "Forget the orders," they said. "This is the Jewish Agency asking you." So I said, "I'll go in. I'll take command here for 24 hours and get southern Jerusalem back for you." It was nighttime. I took Menachem Rusek, and the two of us went in my car.
The Palmach's 5th Battalion joins the fight to save Ramat Rachel, but there is genuine concern the kibbutz will fall. On a morale-boosting visit to a forward position in Talpiot, Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, later to become Israel's president, radios this message.
"Jerusalem is counting on you," was what he said. "Be strong," he added. That was one of the times I felt just how much responsibility had been placed on our shoulders. Responsibility for Jerusalem, for our entire people. I've never forgotten that. At the dining hall, I saw people sitting there with the wounded and the dead who hadn't been evacuated. In the milk shed, the cows were lying feet up and the stench was terrible. The people were depressed and confused. The order was given for the Davidka to fire. The first shot was fired, and the second. One of them hit the children's house. 5 shells from the Fiat also hit the children's house, and a company stormed it. No one was left inside. There was no close quarters fight. No one was left. They'd all escaped through the windows and whatever. They'd fled.
One Palmach company takes Ramat Rachel while the other takes the Mar Elias Monastery. That puts an end to enemy attempts on Ramat Rachel. The danger from the south has been neutralized. Until the Arab Legion appears at Latrun on May 18th, the Jews hold a narrow but secure corridor, stretching from Jerusalem to Hulda, including the radar installation. After the Latrun bottleneck is taken, headquarters sends Battalion 52 south to face the Egyptians. For 2 full days, Latrun remains deserted, only to be occupied by a powerful contingent from the Arab Legion, a full division, reinforced by numerous local Arabs.
Jerusalem could not remain under siege, and Latrun was lost. From our point of view, widening the corridor to Bab el-Wad didn't solve the problem. The bottleneck was still there.
The fall of the Etzion block, the loss of the Jewish quarter and the Old City, the settlements abandoned around Jerusalem, the panicked telegrams bemoaning the fate of the city. All these push Ben-Gurion to make a fateful decision. Latrun must be taken at all costs. The 7th Brigade is assembled hurriedly and its soldiers sent off to battle. For many, this will be the first.
It was late morning when they began evacuating the wounded, and it was very hot. I realized that they hadn't opened the road. The operation had failed.
Attempts begin to move by foot from the foothills to Jerusalem and back. It's a delicate operation. Meanwhile, the battle for Latrun is far from over. 130 are killed and another 200 wounded in what is, in fact, the fight to open the road to Jerusalem. But not in vain. The conquest of Beit Jiz and Beit Susin villages and the 7th Battalion's victories on the road to Latrun enabled it to link up with the Harel Brigade at Shahe Guy. As a result, the Jews now hold a continuous strip of territory between Jerusalem and the foothills, a narrow ribbon surrounded by Jordanians and Egyptians. Within this corridor of hills and gorges, a road must be built.
It was Ra'anana's jeep that made it along the road and the ridge from the other side, and got through, with another 10 people making it on foot. They tried it twice, and we tried to do it from here, and we made it to the terraces beyond the curve. And there, when we met Ra'anana that night, we realized that this was the route. We took a map, drove to headquarters, and reported to Yigal Yadin. We rounded up 13 jeeps with some help from Ben-Gurion.
After nightfall, they tried to move the convoy of 13 jeeps loaded with ammunition from Hulda to Shahe Guy, but one of the jeeps overturns, and they're in danger of reaching the Latrun police fort in daylight. They pull back.
The next night, we made the same trip, and we reached the Harel units on the other side. That was the first complete journey by fully loaded vehicles.
Only history will remember how in early June 1948 the Burma Road was hacked out of the hills. Few expected it to work.
Headquarters reported that the last inventory showed we had 40 rounds of ammunition left for each weapon. One serious attack by the Arab Legion, and we'd be out of ammunition. Our food supplies were low too, enough for just a few days. We advanced for the first time, and with lumniks and mines we rolled the boulders aside and made a more or less passable route, but the incline was steep, and you had to drive well to get up it. There was some reception on the other side, when the entire convoy got to the Harel units down there, to the entrance to Jerusalem. The important thing was there was no more blockade. For us, this was just another operation, like attacking Beit Mahsir, and we didn't think we were making history or anything.
June 2nd. Yitzhak Levy, Levitza, a commander of the Jerusalem Brigade, is granted permission to join Harel to bring ammunition to Jerusalem.
I saw the readiness, the courage, and the unending effort. There was no obstacle we couldn't overcome. The way they dragged those jeeps up by hand, how they found their way in the dark, and how for them success was a foregone conclusion. That's when I saw the real strength of the Palmach. The trucks would reach the top and meet the trucks that came from Jerusalem. Porters would move the cargo from the trucks up to the Jerusalem trucks. It was only later that you could move along the road in both directions.
After the route is marked, porters arrive, followed by mules, and finally, heavy equipment. The road to Jerusalem is open.
Frankly, if someone from the 4th Battalion will tell me he's crazy about Jerusalem, I won't believe him. We weren't old enough to be in the high command, and not young enough to be like those kids who blindly followed their commanders. We were the lower echelon that always went first, the company and platoon commanders. When I look around, I suddenly remember that I'm the only one still alive from the whole group that hiked through Wadi Kelt in 1945. He must have been about 40.
Aviva takes part in one of who knows how many attacks on the radar site. The advanced squad is wiped out. Aviva runs, throws a grenade, and is hit by a bullet and shrapnel. She crawls right back, bleeding heavily. 2 wounded friends drag her as far as they can, then leave her behind.
A soldier I didn't know, a short, broad-shouldered Yemenite, came and picked me up like a sack of flour and started walking with me down the road because he decided he wasn't strong enough to make it over the terraces. They shot at us the whole way, and I kept telling him, "Leave me here, save yourself. In the end, neither of us will make it." And he said, "Never mind." I looked for him for years afterwards, but I never found him.
A ceasefire is imminent, the first break in the fighting. The High Command must subdue Latrun in order to safeguard the Burma Road. After 70 days of continuous fighting, the troops are exhausted. People are wounded, dying. The survivors mount an attack on one of the Latrun hills.
We sat together. Yigal Alon greeted us, smiled and spoke, saying, "I know how hard it is to know that tomorrow you meet the family, while today you're ready to die. But we have no choice."
The Harel fighters are meant to take a lightly defended hill to provide cover and support for the Iftach Brigade brought in from Galilee to attack Latrun's police fort and to cut off Latrun village from the monastery and the police station. But a navigational blunder leads Harel instead to a well-fortified hill crawling with Arab legionnaires.
Look here. I'll go in. Watch. In almost every position, we would jump over the body of a legionnaire. They fought to the finish there. If you duck in, you're in no danger. It was very hard to reach them. It was a pity. By the end of the night, when we took the outpost, not a single legionnaire was left alive there. But we were hardly alive either. Very few of us were left, and we saw their counterattack coming. The decision was made to retreat.
Though imaginative and daring, the Latrun attack plan was poorly executed. Faulty coordination and control among the fighting forces left just 2 companies to fight for their lives in the hills above Latrun.
And I'm thinking, my people are tired and hungry, and they need to shower. And there's a limit to what they can do. How did we achieve victory under such conditions? That's the question. And not why were there failures. How did these people go on walking night after night after night?
June 11th, 1948, the first ceasefire. The people of Harel, once trapped in the Jerusalem hills defending the Burma Road to Jerusalem, now run to the beach, to coffee houses, and to their families.
The feeling was wonderful, like freedom. As if you'd been in prison, and suddenly you see the ocean in front of you.
A month passes. With the resumption of fighting after the first ceasefire, attention now turns to conquering Ramallah and Lod. In a drive that begins July 2nd, the Harel Brigade takes Tsuba village. The 6th Battalion does the job without suffering any losses. Widening the Jerusalem corridor. If the term sounds dry and technical today, back then it meant a blessed end to the fighting along the road.
Even for those who were there, when you think about it after all these years, You can't help but get emotional, because the war for the highway and the ability to move along it, to move along this one and only road, costs us so much blood.
The trains that ply their way between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv would have nowhere to roll, were it not for the 10-day Harel operation that widened the Jerusalem corridor to Hartuv. By its conclusion, the brigade had advanced as far as the combined outpost, today the city of Beit Shemesh. When the Israeli and Egyptian armies finally came to a standstill, they found themselves face to face with just 30 meters between them.
There was a soldier named Yael Sharet Chertok, the daughter of Israel's foreign minister, and in one of the exchanges, the Arabs shouted, "We know Yael is there. Tell her to tell her father to come here and we'll negotiate." That's how close the two sides were. When the wind was blowing in the right direction, you could hear what they were saying.
Beit Shemesh then was just a rugged hill. With the end of the ceasefire, it became the jumping-off point for Harel's assault on the enemy.
It was a face-to-face battle. We took the high ground in a frontal night attack with relatively few casualties. But the biggest blow was losing Jimmy. He'd raised his head and some aimless bullet hit him and killed him.
In the morning, I came to see how many dead there were, but there was only one, lying on a stretcher. As I moved closer, I saw a man sitting on a big rock, holding a piece of sketch paper and drawing a picture of the dead man. It was Jimmy's father, the artist Shemi. He was drawing his own son, dead on the ground in front of him.
October 1948. At full strength, Harel plans to scale the Hebron Mountains and approach Jerusalem from the south. Haganah Chief Operations Officer, Chief of Staff Yigal Yadin, rules out the idea. Only Harel can keep the Arab Legion from the foothills around Jerusalem. One after another, Harel takes Beit Shemesh, Beit Jamal, Nes Harim, and Beit Natif, widening the Jerusalem corridor, finding itself alongside the Etzion block.
We were 4 battalions here, at full force after the break, and they wouldn't let us advance. We couldn't understand why.
The 5th Battalion is assigned to conquer the Beit Jala fortress, while the 5th is sent to take the Etzion block. The commanders scout the area. The troops are assembled.
Everyone, down to the lowest-ranking soldiers, shared a sense of strength, the belief that we could do it.
The Etzion block and Beit Jala attack plans are brought to the government for approval. Ben-Gurion decides against. He believes conquering Christian regions will anger the entire world. Besides, the UN will force Israel to return any areas it takes. Chief of Operations Yigal Yadin is also opposed on military grounds. The Harel commander pushes to have the decision reversed, enlisting other top commanders in the effort. When one of them is brought to a position overlooking the Etzion block, he says, like Moses, that he has seen the promised land but cannot enter.
We sat around that evening, and I don't know if we always did things like that, but Yosefle said, "So guys, what about this order?" I don't know if he wanted to test us or hear our opinions and then decide for himself. Benny was there, and so were Ra'anana, Yosefle, and I, and maybe 1 or 2 others. I'm not sure about the company commanders. The question was, what if we simply disobey an order? I was against disobeying orders. I don't remember if mine was the deciding vote, if it was 2 against 3 or what, but in the end we decided to follow orders and not to advance. That was the decision.
These are the annals of Harel, fighting for Jerusalem in Israel's very first year of life. In that year, 1,000 are wounded, 352 die. Young men and women drawn by destiny to Jerusalem and its hills. People, said one of the fighters, the likes of which there never have been before and never will be again.
Our entire existence was focused on a single goal: to have a state, to establish a Jewish state. That was our goal.
Two things account for our strength, Harel's commander would say. The fact that Jews are compelled to fight, and the Palmach framework, which makes no distinction between one person and the next, between officers and soldiers, in food, sleep, uniforms, or freedom. These, and the understanding that when the moment comes, each and every one of us will take responsibility for the entire war. That's what the commander said. One of his soldiers put it more simply. They instilled the feeling within us that without us, without Harel, there would be no Jerusalem.